It's book tag day, so I am going to do this book tag that Criminali created, and the book tag is called I Know What You Read Last Summer, and all the prompts are basically like summer movies, summer horror movies, that kind of thing. I don't think it has to be books we read last summer. I really hope not, because I don't think I have anything on here that I read last summer, but the way the prompts are written, I don't think that's what it is. So I'm going to go through them now. All right, so the first one we have is Final Girl, and the prompt is a book with a strong female protagonist. So I went with the entire Song of Ice and Fire series, because I think the women in this series are some of the strongest female characters I've ever seen. And what's really interesting is you hear a lot of like, oh, it's misogynistic, there's all this violence against women, and yeah, there is, but what I think is really interesting in particular about the series is I felt the same way in the first few episodes. Like, I was like, okay, this is just like what the women are portrayed as, literally as whores, or they're being abused, and I was like, why is this entertaining? And so it took me a while to watch the show and then to read the books, because I just thought, I kind of wrote it off as sort of misogynistic as well. But I do think if you give it a chance and you read the books and you go through the whole series, and I know it's a commitment, go through the show, what's really intriguing is how it's the violence against women, I feel like, is used more for context, and also to kind of give you a sense of just kind of how much the women are sort of battling. And they all sort of like the best characters, the strongest characters, the most interesting characters in the series are definitely the women. And I think, looking at some of George R. R. Martin's blogs and stuff, I definitely wouldn't agree that he's a misogynist. He seems very, very supportive of women, really likes to promote female writers. And the way he portrays his female characters, I just think they're very strong. And in the face of a lot of things. And I mean, the reality is that it is a patriarchal society. And so you can't just be like, oh, we shouldn't have that. I mean, that's, it is based sort of on medieval history and, the 100 Years' War and the War of the Roses and all that stuff. So I do think, we kind of need to not put our own sort of social standards on this, but I think if you actually go through the series, anyone who has, I think, tends to find that the women are very, very strong. And I feel like that's the point. You watch them evolve into the strongest characters, and in the end of the show, obviously a lot of the women are in positions of power, whereas the men all kill themselves off or end up doing stupid things. So definitely strong female characters in this series. The second one is Popcorn, and this is a book you couldn't put down or stop reading, and so I went with Gone Girl, because I just I flew through this book. It was so much fun and just super engaging, and you just want to know what's going to happen next. So definitely check that out if you haven't read it. If you haven't read it, you should probably just stop what you're doing and go read it. Number 3 is Ticket, and this is the book that sort of introduced you to your favorite genre. That was kind of your entry into that genre. And for me, my favorite genre is generally mystery and thriller, or crime fiction. I don't really like those series that have 50 books and they're all the same detective doing different things, mostly just because it's hard to sort of remember which order they go in, and and then you have to try to track down all of them, and it's just annoying. So I don't tend to read a lot of those. I like a lot of standalones, but and Then There Were None is absolutely the entryway. I mean, I read this I think in 5th grade or something, and was like, oh my god, this is the most brilliant thing I've ever read, and I still think it's the most brilliant thing I've ever read. So I reread it now sometimes, when I've reread it multiple times, and, when I read it now, even, years later, I still am like, oh, it just got me. So, I mean, it's kind of a bad entry into the mystery genre because it's probably one of the best, if not the best. But, in terms of a twist or just, like the structure, but it definitely was like, oh, I need more of this. And this is my favorite specific type of like mystery too, is, people being killed off one by one and being trapped. So, and then there's outdoor cinema, which is sort of like a couple different prompts. So like kind of like a drive-in. And the first is a movie you thought was better than the book, a film adaptation of a book. And I'm going to go with Train Spotting, not because the book was bad, but it's very different and it's kind of hard to read because obviously it's written in like the Scottish dialect. And I did read it after the movie. But I did, when I went and started reading some of Irvine Welsh's books and I liked it. But I mean, the cast is so phenomenal. It's Danny Boyle. I mean, you can't really do better, I feel like, in putting a film together. And he does a really good job of like, staying true to the feel of the book and the mood of the book and most of the, elements of the book, but it's definitely different. And I think the book is probably just as like witty and satirical. But I think some of it was lost on me just because I was so like caught up trying to like understand the dialect, that I think, the movie was just more entertaining for me because I could, although it is still a thick accent, I could still understand more of what was going on. And then I struggled with the next one, which is a sequel that's better than the original. And I went with Empire Strikes Back because, I mean, obviously it's the best in the Star Wars movies, but I know there's definitely a movie out there that I didn't like the original, but ended up liking the sequels. But I can't remember what they are. And so I looked at like, what are the best sequels of all time? But they're all like, the obvious ones, Godfather 2, which I actually haven't seen. I know. But, Toy Story 2. Yeah, but I love Toy Story. Aliens. And yes, it's very different than Alien, but I like both of them. And they're actually kind of like Alien a little bit better because I like that sort of like trapped and slow burn kind of feel. Terminator 2. And again, they're different, but I like them both. So I really couldn't think of one that was like definitely better, except for the fact that obviously, I mean, Empire is just the best entry in the series. So, it's the darkest and it's obviously the big reveal. So it's the best one. And then it was recommend a horror movie. And I like a lot of like indie horror and like psychological horror and horror that's kind of like a disguise for something else, metaphorical horror. So I went with It Comes at Night just because I feel like it's lesser known than, I love Hereditary and A Quiet Place and The Babadook and all those kind of, It Follows. But I feel like those are fairly popular at this point, so I went with It Comes at Night. But I do want to say, like, I like horror, like I said, that's really more psychological. And so this was a really poorly marketed movie. It looks like it's going to be like a horror movie, a monster movie, something's going to come and attack these people. But it's really just like a slow burn of watching people kind of go insane. So you kind of just throw out what you think it's going to be about and just enjoy like how well it's told. I loved this movie. I just thought it was brilliant. I will warn you, and I mean, it's a spoiler, but the dog dies. And so if that's going to be a problem, I knew in advance because like I always go to like Does the Dog Die, that website. The dog does die. So, and it's sad. You see him die. So be prepared for that. I think if you go to doesthedogdie.com, it will tell you like where exactly it is so you can plan for that, because I hate that. I hate that in horror movies. It actually kind of makes sense in this particular movie. Like, I don't feel like it's done cheaply. Like, a lot of the times I feel like they just like kill off the animals because they're like, oh, look, the guy is evil. It makes sense more in this movie just because of what the movie is. So I kind of can tolerate it, but I do warn you as well because I hate that. I hate when the animals die. All right, so number 5 is the movie, and this is a movie you're too scared to watch. nothing. I've never been too scared to watch anything. There's very few movies that really, really scare me. I've been scared a few times in movies. I'm not gonna, say nothing ever scares me, but so I haven't really. I mean, there are definitely movies I won't go see just because they look gross or just really aren't my thing. But generally, I'll give anything a try. But the movie I would never watch again because it was so scary is The Exorcist. I don't know why. Like, this movie terrified me. It's just, I mean, it's really cheesy, like, if, just from, like, a film perspective, but the concepts behind it are just really, really freaky, and, yeah, I never want to ever see this movie again. It's great, though. I mean, you should definitely watch it, but I don't need to see it again. And then 6 is Summer Loving, so it's a great summer read, and I was going to go with Summer Sisters by Judy Blume, which is very much a women's book for like the summer about like your kind of adult friendships in your like 20s and 30s, and so like people you grew up with from your teen years. So obviously it's somewhat niche, and it's depressing, so it's not like even a fun one. Summer I Turned Pretty is actually really fun. I know that's like a popular TV show. I haven't actually watched the TV show. Don't really feel like I need to. That was actually a really good YA series, if for a summer read. But I think I'm going to just go with The Sisterhood of the Traveling Pants because as cheesy as it seems like they would be, they're just really good. Like the characters are well defined. They're just not as silly as you would think they are. They're actually like really a story about friendship, and a lot of the girls have different things going on in their lives, and, it's about having friends who help you through different times in your life, and obviously it's different summers, and they're just really a great YA read, but I feel like even as an adult, I mean, looking back at, like, those friendships that you have that kind of define you as you grow up. The next prompt is Scythe Assassin, and this is a villain you would like to interview. And I really struggled with this, and so what I decided is I wanted to interview Peter Baelish because I don't know if I'm ever going to see the last 2 books in this Song of Ice and Fire series, and I feel like the show let me down because I know there's more to Baelish's story than we got in the show, and so that's who I want to interview because I want to find out the details, because there's more about like the attorney at Harrenhal, the stuff when he was a kid. There's definitely more to him than what's going on, and I mean he's so manipulative and he's doing so many things that there was supposed to be more, and I feel like he just kind of like, oh, and now he's dead, and you're like, well, I feel like there's more to Baelish's story. 8 is a group of friends, but instead of being a good group of friends, it's the worst group of friends in a book. And so I went with Less Than Zero because not only are his friends a bunch of like drug addicts and, really bad influences and trying to like get him not to like go to college and, not to care about college, but like they literally kidnap a young girl and abuse her. And yeah, so he has the worst friends ever. So I love this book, but I mean, it's Bret Easton Ellis. If you don't know anything about Bret Easton Ellis, do not go into reading Bret Easton Ellis without like doing some research because it's so dark and so twisted and just so awful. But this book is amazing. Really, really great book. But yeah, definitely needs some warning because there's a lot of really like horrible content. But the point is there. He doesn't do it, I don't feel like, for shock value. It's just, I mean, his characters are horrible people. All right, and so 9 is End of Course, and this is the last book you didn't finish, and this is like first and last was The Priory of the Orange Tree. And again, I usually try to stick it out, but this was 900 pages. It was due back to the library. I wasn't feeling it. I was like more than halfway through, and I was like, you know what, I'm done, because I don't even want to read it, and I have to try to rush through it to get to the end, and I just didn't care anymore, and so I did return it, and I'm not going to go back to it. So this was like definitely, if it's 300 pages, I'll usually force my way to the end of it, because I usually will give it to at least like 30-40%, but and at that point you might as well finish it. But I mean, when you're talking 900 pages and you're not enjoying any of it, it's just stop. 10 is Summer Party, but instead of being a fun party, it's a horrible party, and party you definitely wouldn't want to attend. So I went with the party to celebrate the grandmother's birthday and Daisy Darker, because the characters are being killed off one by one every hour. So, and that's in the synopsis, so it's not like a surprise. But yeah, you don't want to be at that party. The next one is We Have a Secret, and this one I struggled with so bad. It was a character who talks too much. And I ended up going with Quincy from Dracula, mostly because I think like all of, not Mina, Lucy's suitors are all horrible and annoying. They're so like arrogant. I mean, obviously, Dracula is such a great example of a writer who wrote a book that he didn't realize he was writing because he was so repressed and so like terrified of female sexuality that in a way his book that was like so terrified, showing how terrifying women's sexuality was, ends up becoming sort of like a story about like repression and the Victorian fear of women's sexuality. So, kind of accidentally, but the men are just so ridiculous. Like, oh, we're gonna preserve her honor, and they talk all the time, and they're always like one-upping each other, and they're all so arrogant. And I mean, I love the book, don't get me wrong, but like they're all so annoying, but good characters. But I feel like they talk too much. Otherwise, I was gonna go with like Davos in A Song of Ice and Fire, and I don't really dislike Davos. I just feel like there was a period where there were like a million chapters and Davos was just like hanging out and like talking to like servants and like about kitchens and like how to cook food, and I was kind of like, okay. So every time I would see Davos is like the chapter had Davos, I was like, oh no, here we go. But he doesn't really talk that much. It's just for some reason George R. R. Martin must have been hungry when he was writing those chapters. So number 12 is Cabin in the Woods, and this is the perfect setting for a book. And I actually went with a TV show, which was Harper's Island, because this is my dream. Like, I love anything that has to do with like a secluded island, a big beautiful mansion on this secluded island. There's like one boat or that gets you in, or the tide comes in, like in Daisy Darker, but somehow once you get to the island, you basically are trapped there until like the next day. There's, whether it's the tide or the ship schedule, but for some reason, there's all these people and they're trapped in this big house on this island on the water. It's spooky. There's usually a storm, and then people are being killed. And so like that's my favorite setting. Obviously I said And Then There Were None was my ticket, and there you go. Still love that type of book. And then 13 was Friday the 13th, the last book that traumatized you, and surprisingly it was Mr. Magic, which is kind of a horror novel, but I just cried through the whole thing, and it just made me so depressed, because it's really like horror, and I said I love metaphorical horror, and this is really like horror as metaphor for trauma, and it was just beautiful but intense, so very heartbreaking. I'm going to do more on this and Daisy Darker in my reading wrap up for the month anyway, but yeah, so those are my I Know What You Read Last Summer book tag, and yeah, so I will be back, I'm sure, next week with another tag, and actually probably my monthly wrap up. All right, bye.